Well, thank you so much, Your Excellency, for the keynote, which I think sets us up very well for our discussion today. So I think there's pretty much a growing consensus that we're probably not on track to achieve those goals right now by 2030. This is something at SDSN we've been documented on a yearly basis through the SDG index, but there's also a growing consensus that geospatial data and information can help support and accelerate SDG implementation at various stages of the policy design, right? From the design, from the monitoring, the costing, the implementation phases. And so maybe we can just take, we have obviously great representatives here and different perspectives from government, international organizations, but also the private sector, and just a first round of answers from the panel here about where do you see the biggest potential for Earth observation, geospatial information and technologies to support sustainable development. And maybe we can start with you, Minister Begović.
Thank you very much. Okay. Well, I mean, on a global level, we're facing huge challenges and big challenges in environment, energy, food, water. They require global answers and solutions. And I see it in based on two different pillars. One is knowledge and science. But for those global challenges, we need data. So data are really crucial to reach SDGs, and somehow, they're skipping away, some of them at least. So high quality, large amount of data. For instance, if we talk about the oceans and what the satellite and Earth observation can provide us, are different sets of data like temperature, high tide, low tide, red tide, oil spills, but also migrations of animals, migrations including fish, waves. And these data can serve for reaching different SDGs, whether it's energy, renewable energies, whether it's hunger, so SDG 2, whether are questions related to environment. And all of these data, at the end, have to serve for the government to come to some kind of decisions. But it needs to be evidence-based. And for the evidence, we need data.
Yeah, and I guess that's a great segue to you, Yana, as the director of a group that is working on partnership to harness geospatial data for this agenda. Where do you see some good examples of how geospatial data and information are being leveraged by your member governments and member organizations at GEO?
Thank you very much, Guillaume, and good afternoon to everyone. My sincere apologies for sitting you in my back. This is the second day that I have to follow Her Excellency, and it's both a privilege and a bit tricky because she always sets the scene so fully and completely. She makes the case for pretty much all of us. So SDGs, there are 17 of them, right? And there are a total of 200, let's check our SDG knowledge, 200 plus indicators, yeah. I think. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So imagine if every country starts to develop their own projects that allow them to monitor and report on those indicators. That's an enormous amount of individual activities. What does geospatial information and Earth observation bring to it? In fact, it's the ability to speak one language. One common language. It's not a very familiar language, this whole spatial, geospatial, but truly it has this unique ability to bring a common language to from the science community to the policy community and to the investing community. So the decisions, the negotiations, the target setting, the baseline setting, as well as investments that are channeled into the various projects are actually using a common source of information, providing that common footing, which ultimately, in an ultimate ideal, will drive coherence across our scientific knowledge, across policy, and across investing. I think that is, at least in my mind, the ultimate kind of vision towards which we all need to drive as we're thinking about effective governance system. And we have examples of data having served for decades. Governments are not just governments to make smart decisions. The satellites have been buzzing around the world for 70 years, Earth observation satellites. That's how long we have been receiving information about the weather. And it's difficult to imagine how we can live without that actionable information. Every morning we wake up, we check the weather. Now we need to do the same for nature, for our natural capital. And there is an unprecedented opportunity within the public and the private sector. We have one fantastic partner here with us today whose data combined with advanced technologies such as artificial intelligence can really help us not only to continue with the series of important observations, but most importantly, to fill the data gaps. Because to be honest, the shocking number is that, let's take nature and biodiversity, 80% of the biodiversity data is coming from 10% of the countries. So with satellite data and observations, we can effectively and cost-effectively fill gaps. And if we leverage artificial intelligence and other observations, we can truly have robust information that can then inform our aspirations and implementations of SDGs in a very coherent way, because the one either brilliant or tricky thing about these SDGs is how interconnected and interdependent they are. If we take care of SDG 14 and 15, life on Earth, life below water, through SDG 17 on partnerships, we will be able to address the vitality of our nature, vitality of our economy, and ultimately vitality of our society. And so it's the introduction of this common spatial language into science, policy, and investment circles, as I think where we have a unique opportunity in this moment in time.
Yeah, no, thank you, Yana. And I guess this notion of a common spatial language resonates also to you, Your Excellency. Can you share some of your thoughts around how geospatial information technologies can help us in this journey towards sustainable development on Earth?
First of all, thank you for having me here. And I mean, definitely, geospatial technologies are critical to inform policies, especially policies that are related to the environment, the climate, food and water, resources management, and so on. I mean, within the science technology community, there's a saying that says, science and technology policy, or policy for science and technology, and there's also technology for policy, or science and technology for policy. So here we're actually applying science and technology to come up with more informed, educated policies. The kind of information that space gives us, the depth of information it gives us, the range of information it gives us is very critical and important in managing whether it's disasters, predicting certain environmental disasters that might be taking place, and managing crisis also. At the same time, also, when it comes to managing the resources, the available resources, and how to better manage them in a way to be more efficient and effective. So it's very important. And then the question is how do we start balancing things when it comes to advanced dual-use technologies? How are we able to give access to the researchers and civilians more precise, advanced geospatial information that helps them in managing the resources, monitoring the climate, and so on. And I think this is a challenge that we really have to start exploring, because with the sensitivities that comes with some technologies and the kind of the nature that comes with it, it limits us. And we understand certain things that cannot be maybe shared at this point, but then how do we start preparing the communities or putting systems or processes in place that accelerate the responsible sharing or access to advanced technologies that gives us more precise data that helps us in general.
Yeah, good, wonderful. And turning over to you, Andrew, as someone that deploys at Planet some of those satellites around the Earth, what's your take here? I mean, we heard His Excellency talking about how they can be useful for short-term emergency crises, but also about long-term transformations, biodiversity plans, climate actions. What's your take from your perspective at Planet?
Well, thank you for the question, and it's great to come after all of you, because you've set up, I think, some things really perfectly. So let me back up for a moment. For those of you who have maybe not heard of our organization before, we're an entity called Planet. We're what's called a public benefit corporation. We have a very specific organizational legal incorporation that, as a private sector entity, requires us, not just encourages us, but requires us to produce more public value than for stakeholders rather than shareholder return. And we are best known for having built and deployed the largest constellation of Earth observing satellites in history. Normally, satellites that look at the Earth, for those of you who are not geospatial or remote sensing engineers or aerospace engineers, normally they're about the size of a school bus. And a group of young NASA engineers said, well, you know, they're very expensive. They're designed to last for a long period of time. So if we work on them sequentially, we'll only get to work on 1 or 2 missions in our whole careers. So they went down to our local consumer electronics store and they bought a group of these things. They took them back to the lab. They took the guts of the phone out of the lab and they built a tiny little satellite you could hold in the palm of your hand, and they secretly gave it to one of the astronauts headed to the International Space Station and asked her to throw it out the airlock when she got there to see how your phone would do in space. And it turns out your phone does great in space if it's shielded correctly, and it has a camera and a computer and a radio and all kinds of things that the big instruments have in a very small package. And that allowed us to build hundreds of them, and they orbit. And Yana, I will use you as an involuntary prop. Imagine Yana is the sun. Here's it's not hard to imagine. And here we have the Earth, right, spinning around. You all remember on a daily basis, this is a group of hundreds of satellites that spin from pole to pole. And as the Earth turns sideways underneath them, we image the whole planet every day in high resolution. And we've been doing it for thousands of days now. We have a deep stack of the history of the planet. And unless you're an astronaut, every place you've ever been, we've been looking at basically every day since the middle of 2017. So I mention that just because it's relevant to answering the question that you raised. So we find ourselves in a very strange moment right now. And that moment is one of existential crisis, right? We are living through a climate crisis and potentially the 6th extinction in the history of life on Earth. We are also, however, living through the second renaissance, a giant explosion of knowledge and capacity. And it's not just the satellites. If it were just the satellites, we'd have a big problem because we're producing way more data than we could possibly use. But the ability to combine artificial intelligence and cloud computing and remote sensing and all of the scientific and social development knowledge that we have accrued in all of these institutions. There are people here from the World Bank and from governments around the world. The ability to take all of that knowledge and combine it with these tools to produce real-time planetary indicators is extraordinary and unprecedented. Now, I'll just mention one that's related directly to SDG 7. We just announced at the UN General Assembly a partnership with Microsoft's AI team and the Nature Conservancy, a large NGO, in which we're taking all of our satellite imagery and we're identifying every renewable energy utility grade implementation on Earth continuously. So we have a comprehensive mapping of where all the world's renewable energy is, literally updated retroactively to the beginning of the SDG period and forward to 2030, so that we can track progress on one piece of our work toward SDG 7. We work on another major program where we're mapping and monitoring all of the world's coral reefs in real time. And we're using that data now to help encourage the incorporation of 30 new marine protected areas around the world right now in advance of SDG 14, sorry, which is life below water. And so like we're beginning to see something really powerful. And that is that we can use this kind of information to produce new kinds of feedback loops, action loops. And this is where I'll end my thought, is just this one idea. I work with people, you know, sometimes in English we have this expression, it's not rocket science, right? Meaning rocket science is really complicated. I work with people who say, it's only rocket science. And they're much smarter than I am. And the thing that's really fascinating is that when you're building a satellite, you need to put instruments on the satellite that tell you about the position of the satellite, that operate and monitor the satellite at least as fast as the forces of change that are acting upon it. Because otherwise, if you just took a picture of where the satellite was every few minutes, it could tumble out of control and you could never recover. Well, I have news for everybody. We live on a satellite. It just happens to orbit the sun, right? And that instrument needs continuous monitoring if we're going to effectuate the great transition. And the SDGs are nothing but a blueprint for affecting that transition. So in fact, they are the command and control structures that you want to implement in the monitoring programs for the Earth. And that's really where we're at.
Right, right. And so, you know, I guess what we're hearing here is that the opportunities are phenomenal.
Yeah.
And that it's not only about, you know, being the police at the end. It's not only about monitoring or accountability, but it's also how you integrate those geospatial data information technologies within the full policy cycle. So I'd like to go back to you, Minister Begović. We heard from your Prime Minister a couple of minutes ago about how science, technology, innovation are being mobilized in Serbia in support of those SDGs. You are the minister in charge. Could you tell us a bit more how your ministry is involved, and also where does those geospatial information technologies fit in within your priorities?
Yeah, well, I mean, Republic of Serbia is really committed towards, you know, achieving SDGs as much as we can. I will give you just few examples from the side of Ministry of Science, Technological Development and Innovations, where they were implemented for the really benefit of the local community, but also the government as a whole. So we have a platform for remote detection of depopulation processes. So instead of using classical regular data, we're following dynamics of population changes through, for instance, satellite images during the night of night lights. So in a longer period of time, you can really see how this dynamics is changing. If we talk about years of period of years. Also, thanks to our scientists, we have a platform for identification of the areas within within Serbia that should be and could be planted with certain type of trees. So we stop different devastation of ecosystems, loss of biodiversity, and similar. And this is also used by satellite data and some very complicated mathematical models, but it's really beyond me. Then we have satellite image management of disasters, thanks to Copernicus data. So we are targeting and identifying areas with high risk of flood, or areas that are prone to landslides. And this helps us, even for the local communities and municipalities, you know, to make plans for infrastructure investments or some different kinds of interventions in order to mitigate future events or problems with future events. And also, one of the most important parts of our industry is agriculture. So as a scientific community and as a government, we definitely recognize this. and we recognize the potential of digital and bio. So in 2016, a Biosense Institute was established in collaboration with the European Union, between government and EU, with the aim of using, if we're talking about satellite data, satellite technologies, and remote sensing, with the aim to assist agriculture. So to assist single farmer, but also to assist the development of agriculture in Serbia, particularly in these moments when we are really hit hard by the climate change. So very unpredictable weather in our geographical area, and the only way we can fight it is through science and data, and that includes artificial intelligence, for instance, prediction of seeds for the next year, prediction of floods, prediction of drought. So we have really extreme changes in a very short period of time. So thanks to European Space Agency, we signed the contract as a government, but through this Biosense Institute, we are really using immensely this kind of data for this instance of agriculture. And now in combination with AI, we're building with Ministry of Agriculture state-of-the-art system for assistance of the government and farmers in a whole process of farming. And this includes even the banks that are giving loans, subventions, or anything that relates a person, a farmer, to the agriculture and to the government. So we're trying really to put everything together.
Right. And maybe turning over to Your Excellency. So we're hearing here from Serbia about how geospatial information and technologies are increasingly being used to support this agenda. We heard also about cooperation with space agencies. You are, of course, Assistant Minister for Advanced Science and Technology Affairs. You're also the chair of the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. And I must also say that you were in charge of the mission which put HOBE probe into the orbit of Mars in February 2021. So we're pretty much celebrating today the 2 years anniversary of this. So you have a very practical experience here. There are a number of governance challenges around this. I think the latest estimate from the UN Office for Outer Space Affairs is that there's right now more than 8,000 satellites orbiting around Earth now. In your experience, and maybe in your work and discussion in this UN committee, what is required today to maximize the harmonious and effective use of outer space to support sustainable development?
It's a very difficult question to answer, actually. I mean, the answer to it, there's an answer to it, but it's not one thing that you have to do. When you approach this issue, and it is an issue, it's a challenge, having so many objects around Earth, so many satellites, whether it's functioning or not, also orbiting Earth, that would put other space assets into risk, might put some, even if it's big enough, some countries at risk when it actually re-enters Earth. And it needs to be addressed, and it will be addressed. However, how can we do it in a smart and fair way at the end of the day? How can I do it in a way that it allows emerging space nations to build their capacity and capabilities to put systems in space? Because let's be very honest, based on our experience, based on what we see, space is a driver for innovation. Space is the driver, one of the drivers for innovation, one of the drivers for creativity also. And that's critical if you want to inspire the young generation to go into STEM and to have your economy flourish through competitive technical capability, and to have a, I guess, more competitive knowledge-based economy. So, and then at the same time, you want to promote responsible behavior. So you have two extremes. You have a group of nations who've been putting systems in space for a very long time, with not a lot of regulations, not a lot of rules and limitations, who are able to experiment. And then you have nations who had a different kind of, environment that they had to deal with. It took them longer to reach where they are today. So we need to be very careful also when setting guidelines and standards, even if it's not binding. Because let's be very honest, even non-binding eventually becomes binding. So in different ways. I'll use an example, the Mars mission. For example, when the UAE in 2014 decided to send a mission to Mars, we did not have a space agency. We didn't have like a federal space agency. We had space centers and entities around the UAE, but there was no federal space agency. But since day one, we've decided to follow the planetary protection procedures in our designs. We became members of COSPAR 3 years later. But again, planetary protection, it's a voluntary standard that you can take or not. However, we decided to follow it since day one. Did it add more complications to the designs? Yes. Because you have more requirements. And let's be very honest, and people who work in space systems, the more technical requirements you put, the more complicated things get, because you have to verify it, you have to test it, and so on. And you need to meet those requirements, or else you consider that it's an anomaly or a non-conformance. So the good thing is the UAE decided to take that action since day one. However, it added complications. When we wanted to launch the spacecraft, for certain parts to leave certain countries, or for certain parts to enter certain countries, the first question we were asked was, did you actually follow the planetary protection procedures? We're like, yes, and we had to show them also, we had to verify it to them, in which you've got an expert who had to verify it for them. But then, so this is where it comes to, as in, even if we say it's non-binding, eventually it becomes binding. And that wouldn't be fair to nations that are actually building their capacity. And we really need to rethink how we should do that, honestly. There's two approaches of doing that. It's either we allow people just to go and experiment and make it messy up there, or we start cooperating and sharing knowledge openly. If I'm an emerging space nation that doesn't have, let's say, a system that's able to deorbit, don't come and force me and corner me and ask me to come and buy a deorbiting system and put it in my system, because that will complicate it and will pull the prices up and will limit my innovation. Maybe an approach should be taken, it should be considered, share with me the knowledge. Tell me how to build it. Give me the IP. Certain IPs could be shared. We're not talking about the highly sensitive ones, but we're talking about IPs that's able to deorbit our systems that in a safe way to make it enter Earth and not put space assets into risks or even nations at risks. So these kinds of discussions needs to happen. Is it going to be easy? I don't think so. But sooner or later, we will be forced to have these discussions. And sooner or later, we'll be forced to come up with solutions. And sooner or later, we'll have to be very realistic about how we approach these issues and not polarize it.
Right. And so you spoke about the standards, the procedures, but you also spoke about the importance of cooperation and partnerships. And here I'd like to turn it over to you, Yana, because the Group on Earth Observations is basically a cooperation between a large number of governments and organizations. Why do you think those partnerships are so important to address some of the challenges or the barriers that remain in order to leverage even further geospatial information and technologies, whether those barriers are technical, financial, related to processes, or even around education and skills? What role for those kinds of global and multi-stakeholder partnerships?
I think we shouldn't even be debating whether partnerships are important indeed, because we absolutely cannot do without them. We need to absolutely recognize that our world is disparate. And as some countries have continuously done well for themselves, others are emerging as space-faring nations and are beginning to acquire space capabilities or developing their own. There are also those communities that they don't have time. For them, it's, are we still going to be here a few years from now? Let's take the island of Tuvalu, right? We're talking about the large ocean states. Those guys are never going to develop their own space programs. Yet they are the ones who rely on partnerships to provide them with information and knowledge to take care of not just their land, but their culture. just for protection and survival. The only way we can do this and that is what I love about the Group on Earth Observation, is that we were created, in fact, back in 2003 after the World Summit on Sustainable Development that took place in Johannesburg in 2002. That summit recognized the importance of Earth observations for sustainable development and specifically emphasized how important that is for the developing countries. And creating this equity, information equity, knowledge equity, has remained the central part of our ethos. And right now, like never before, we need to be creating these opportunities for all. This phrase, leaving no one behind, is becoming maybe overused and a bit of a cliche, but it is absolutely true. And so this concept of sharing knowledge is absolutely true. International collaboration is, we love to talk about it, but it's funny, it doesn't always come easy. Politicians talk about the collaboration, scientists talk about collaboration, but sometimes when push comes to shove, there is a bit of still protectionism in our own ways, in our own knowledge. We promote open science and open knowledge, but even scientific research is not always shared openly. So we truly are kind of putting things into nth gear to put this international collaboration into the kind of focus so we can truly deliver timely, comprehensive information, especially to those who need it the most. I don't know if I fully answered your question.
Yeah, you did.
But I think yes.
Yeah. No, that was a great answer. And just thinking about you here, Andrew. So we heard from the experience of Serbia. We heard about international partnerships, cooperations. When it comes to the private sector, and I know you're not a typical private sector organization. In fact, your title is Chief Impact Officer. So we heard also from Yana about the equity dimension. Can you say a few words about this term impact? How do you define this at Planet, and both at Planet but also within the broader SDG ESG reporting? Where do you see this geospatial and information and technology fitting in?
Well, thank you, Guillaume. I have to say it's a strange title to have the word impact in your title in a space company that's supposed to keep things on orbit. Is always a little strange. Sometimes my aerospace engineers friends look at me and they think, no, we want no impact whatsoever. I wanted to maybe a couple of observations before we get to the meat of that answer. The most important thing in this conversation, one of the most important sort of setups in this conversation was something we glossed over, which is the problems are big and they're moving away from us. We are less likely to fulfill the agenda now. And so what does that mean? Well, it really means that the central organizing metric is time. It's not money. It's not even technological production for its own sake. It's what can we do now? Our colleagues at the IPCC before COP26, not the one we just had in Sharm el-Sheikh, laid out 5 scenarios for the future of humanity in relevance directly to climate. And only one of those did we stabilize the climate, and it requires us to act immediately. This is not some future state. This is a thing where, this day is the most important day in the decade. And tomorrow will be the most important day in the decade, because if our optionality is decreasing by the day, by definition, every day we have is the most potent potential day we have. And so I think about that as it relates to what Yana was saying, is what you were saying, Your Excellency, about the need for cooperation. And one of the really powerful things about the space sector, such as it is, we are not really, we think of ourselves, we're sort of incidentally in the space sector, really in the data sector. But in that space, so much of what we do comes from the provenance of what governments have done and what the public sector has done. There would be no entity like us without enormous amount, like we are wholly determined by the decisions of governments, just among other things, to commercialize low Earth orbit, to make it possible to regulate it, et cetera, et cetera. So there's no possibility for us to do anything other than partner because we are so interwoven from that perspective, and because the loudest noise we hear is the ticking of the clock. So what does that motivate us to do as a consequence? Well, one of the first things, just to tie a couple of the threads we heard together, 25% of the work we do is in agriculture. If we just take that one agricultural, and this is to pick up on something that Yana said, one of the principal drivers, maybe the principal driver of deforestation is agriculture. So if we can make agriculture more efficient, we can de-intensify the impacts on deforestation, which, among other things, is a principal conduit for zoonotic illnesses to transfer between wildlife and livestock and humans. So there's a health, and you get all those compounding benefits, but only if you do it right now, not next year, not 5 years from now. So the thing, you will, but you don't get, the biggest bang for the investment is now. So we have a focus on what we call digital public goods because we recognize the enormous unevenness of the capacity. So, when we talk about capacity problems, we either talk about somehow deploying PhDs to low resource settings, right? But notice that we never talk about a capacity problem in using Google. Because Google solved the capacity problem for search by making an incredibly easy to use user interface. So we have to do the same. We have to invest in making things incredibly easy to use. And AI is going to help in a really profound way. And we have to figure out financing to create structures where the data can be distributed widely in formats that are relatively easy to use to address this. And there's, again, we come back to what are the SDGs. We can see them as a problem, a sort of very large compound problem statement, or we could see them as the engineering requirements for each one of those platforms. There will be an Earth data platform in which you will ask questions of the Earth. You will get an answer back, and you may never see a pixel of geospatial data. That will be here in the next 24 months. I guarantee it. I 100% guarantee it's coming. And not because we have some secret, I'm not revealing a product. Everybody is chasing after it. And all of this chat GPT that you keep hearing about, all of this Dolly, all that stuff that's happening, someone's going to merge it with all the world's geospatial data and make it searchable and make it answerable for these kinds of questions. So that's the really good news. The good news is tools are coming. The downside, or the gap that I would point out, is if we are living in data abundance and we're going to have tool set abundance and we have fierce urgency, the rate limiting factor becomes political will and shared social conscience of the problems. Because I can tell you, every time I come to a new city, I just asked my cab driver, as I did last night at 1 in the morning when I arrived, what are the SDGs? And my cab driver asked me which hotel that was. Was there a new hotel in town? Was the SDG resort, right? So when our citizens don't have any kind of resonance about what the problem is, when they don't understand how to hold their leaders accountable for progress against these problems, then we're all let off the hook while the world still burns. So the very last thing I'll just say is the thing that's so interesting to me about these tools is not just the way they will enable tighter feedback loops in policy and greater transparency and accountability and greater and more effective and targeted government action when governments have limited resources and all of this stuff to deal with, but it also might contain the tools for the kind of deep transformation of consciousness that is required for us to live in a different relationship with the Earth. Because when the 2030 agenda, if it's ever fulfilled, is fulfilled, if on that day, no one has any real sense of a different relationship, a shared different ecological and social relationship between humanity and the rest of the natural world that we are inextricably entwined with, we will have to start all over. So we have to affect both. And I actually think that, like I get to look at these images of the earth every day. And what I can tell you is if you look at them every single day, they change you. They change how you feel in relationship to what's happening. And so we try to radiate that impact in the world. The end.
Going back to the impact. Yeah. Well, on those inspiring words, we're going to have to close this panel. So please join me in thanking our panelists with a round of applause.